Good afternoon and welcome to this special weekly edition of IBA News, summing up the main stories and voices of the week. Joining me today to discuss developments is attorney Michael Partham from the Movement for Equality Government, and later we'll be joined by Professor Alon Tal of Ben Gurion University, who is a veteran environmental activist. Following a week of speculation and strict gag order, it can now be revealed today that police and the Shin Bet have arrested members of a Jewish terror group suspected of being responsible for a number of attacks, including the torching of the Dawabshe family home in the village of Duma 4 months ago that killed an Arab toddler and its parents. The identity and number of the suspects in the cell and other details are still under censorship. This follows an intensive 4-month investigation and reveals the extent in which the Shin Bet has been able to infiltrate into the Jewish terror cells. Following the Duma torching in late July, Israeli leaders pledged to crack down on violent far-right Jewish groups, but there has been criticism recently from the UN over the slow progress in solving the Duma case. In the past months, the Political Security Cabinet has approved the use of administrative detention against suspected Jewish terrorists. Jerusalem courts this week ruled on 2 cases involving Israeli Jews committing terrorist crimes. The first was the torching of a Jewish Arab school in Jerusalem, and the second was the conviction in the murder of a Palestinian teenager last summer. We get more in this report. The arsonist who torched a Jewish Arab school has been sentenced to 3 years in prison. In issuing his sentence, the Jerusalem District Court judge said that Yitzhak Gabay only meant to damage property, not hurt anyone. Gabay, who the Shin Bet said belonged to the Jewish extremist group Lehava, was the third of a trio convicted of setting fire to the bilingual, hand-in-hand school in Jerusalem exactly 1 year ago. 2 brothers, Rachamim and Nacham Twito, were sentenced last June to 2 years and 2.5 years respectively in a plea bargain. They claimed they had chosen the school after hearing it had held a ceremony marking the passing of former PLO chief Yasser Arafat. They also wrote on the walls, "Death to Arabs," and "There is no coexistence with cancer." No one was hurt in the arson, but it drew national and international condemnation.
Well, the arsonist tried to set on fire not only our classrooms and the children's clothing and textbooks. They tried to set on fire fear and terror to try and derail us from our way. It was a very scary night and a very difficult morning, but they didn't scare us, and they're not going to derail us from our way, from the values we choose to educate our children, and the way of life we chose, living together and studying together, Jews and Arabs, here in Jerusalem.
And on Monday, the same Jerusalem District Court convicted 2 Israeli minors in the murder of Palestinian youth Mohammed Abu Kader in July 2014. However, the ringleader's verdict was delayed after an unprecedented 11th-hour insanity plea submitted by his lawyer. The last-minute psychiatric evaluation of the main suspect, Yosef Chaim Ben David, claimed he was not responsible for his actions at the time of the murder. The 2 minors, whose names have not been made public but are the nephews of Ben David, were also convicted of kidnapping, attempted kidnapping, battery, and attempted arson. The trio nabbed Abu Kader from the Jerusalem Arab neighborhood of Shurfat, beat him with a wrench, and burned him to death. They said they were acting to avenge the murder of Israelis, including the 3 teenagers Gilad Sher, Eyal Yifrach, and Naftali Frenkel. The episode enraged Palestinians and shocked Israelis and contributed to the violence that culminated in last summer's war with Gaza. Palestinians deplore the delay as a miscarriage of justice.
We, on one hand, see it as some sort of achieving justice in this case of the very rude, cruel murder of this Palestinian child that was burned alive by those 3. But on the other hand, we are still worried and concerned about the fact that the main convicted, the adult guy, has not been finally convicted and found guilty.
The court is expected to rule on Ben David at the next hearing on December 20th. Convicted murderers normally receive full life sentences, but there is speculation that as minors they will receive a lesser sentence. Security forces remain on high alert amid a relative slowdown in stabbings and attempted terror attacks this week. This morning, an Israeli civilian and an IDF soldier were moderately injured in a shooting attack near the Chizmeh checkpoint, north of Jerusalem. The Palestinian gunman exited his vehicle and opened fire. Soldiers on the scene shot back, killing the attacker on the spot. On Sunday, there were two separate incidents inside Jerusalem. A border police officer was lightly injured in the Old City's Haggai Street after he was attacked by a terrorist who was shot and killed on the scene by other forces in the area. 3 hours later, a 17-year-old Palestinian from the West Bank city of Hebron stabbed a female tourist in the back. The woman, a resident of Nepal, was standing at the bus stop located on the city's Shamgar Street. She was evacuated to hospital in light to moderate condition. The assailant, who managed to escape the scene, was located shortly after at a nearby construction site. He was holding a knife covered in blood and confessed to carrying out the attack. On Tuesday, there were two attempted attacks in the West Bank. First, a terrorist tried to stab a group of Israelis waiting at a bus station. Soldiers at the scene shot and killed the assailant. Several hours later, a female Palestinian terrorist pulled out an axe and attempted to attack soldiers near the Enav checkpoint. She too was shot and killed on the scene. In related developments, early this morning, the Army demolished the Nablus home of the terrorist who masterminded the fatal murder of Eitam and Naama Henkin inside the West Bank 2 months ago. IDF engineers, joined by an elite Army unit, entered the Dahariya neighborhood in the West Bank city of Nablus to carry out the demolition after the High Court rejected a petition against the order earlier this week. The Henkin couple were shot dead as they were traveling in their car near the settlement of Itamar on the 1st of October. The couple's 4 small children were in the back seat of the car at the time of the murder, but were uninjured. On Wednesday, forces demolished the home of Hamas terrorist Ibrahim al-Akiri, who killed 2 Israelis in a car ramming attack in Jerusalem 1 year ago. The mass operation was carried out by hundreds of forces deployed in the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Shuafat. El-Akiri drove his van into 2 groups of Israelis standing at the Shimon HaTzadik light rail stop last November. The terrorist then jumped out of his vehicle and attacked bystanders with an iron bar before he was shot dead by police. Border Police Officer Jadin Assad from the Druze village of Beit Jan and 17-year-old yeshiva student Shalom Ba'adani were both killed in that attack. Yesterday's demolition was carried out under the order of the commander of the Home Front. Joining me now in the studio to discuss this and other affairs is attorney Michael Parham of the Movement for Quality Government. Michael, is there a separate law for Jewish terrorists and going after Palestinian terrorists?
No, there's not a separate law. There are equal laws apply to criminals no matter what background they come from. There are questions sometimes about the equal enforcement of the law, and those questions are raised by most everybody who's accused of a crime, who believes that he's been unfairly singled out. I think it is important that the state, the leadership in the government and also in the legal services, the Attorney General and the State Prosecutor, show that they are even-handed and prove that they're steadfast and resolute in rooting out crime and terrorism wherever it may come from.
And yet people have been complaining, the UN complained this week that there was slow progress in this whole investigation of the Dawabsha family arson. Have they been conditioned not to go after this with as much force as against Palestinian terrorism?
We live in a heavily politicized society. As a counter to that heavy politicization of almost all aspects of life in Israel, we have a heavily legalistic society. We have plenty of lawyers and plenty of judges who feel that their sole mission in life is to even-handedly carry out the law. That, I believe and we hope, provides a bulwark against the winds of politics, which blow this way in one direction one day and another direction the next day.
Let's move on to the house demolitions. People are saying that this is a deterrent for against other terrorism, but other people say that this is collective punishment. What do you think about this?
Well, the courts have struggled with this issue. There have been many split decisions. So obviously there are cases to be made one way or the other. I'm not personally, this is a personal and not an organizational position. I personally think that we are in a state of terror, of combating terror.
Do you think this is a deterrent for other terrorists?
As it is empirically proven to be a deterrent to terror, so I believe that it's appropriate. That always need to be tested and fit to the circumstances. So one case might be appropriate, the other case might not be appropriate. But if we look at the actual damage done,
mm-hmm.
and what is inflicted here as against human life itself. So when we weigh both in the balance, I think it might be a small price to pay for achieving a greater goal.
Michael, please stay with us. We're going to be coming back to you. We're moving on to other topics. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu arrived in Paris at the start of the week to take part in the annual UN Summit on Climate Change. Prime Minister took the opportunity to meet with a series of leaders as they addressed the current security situation in Israel as well as future cooperations. Among the people Netanyahu shook hands with was PA President Mahmoud Abbas. The two were standing next to each other as they prepared to pose for a group photo, and Netanyahu was quick to dismiss hopes of a possible rapprochement, telling reporters the gesture was purely protocol, nothing else. Addressing the crowd of some 150 world leaders who gathered in Paris, the Prime Minister hailed Israel's leading role in addressing climate change. He highlighted Israeli agricultural and irrigation technologies and innovations as pivotal methods to combat the global crisis. At the start of his speech, the Premier used the podium to condemn the ongoing wave of terrorism plaguing Israel and the world.
But the terrorists who struck down innocent people in Paris, well, they make the same mistake as their counterparts who strike down innocent people in Israel. They fail to realize that those same shared values are the source of our strength, the strength we summon to overcome the pain of our losses, and the strength we summon to defeat the tyranny of the terrorists, the tyranny they seek to impose on our civilization, which always gets stronger, passing each test, overcoming each challenge. We have to recognize that radical incitement and lies feed terrorism. Those who are committed to peace must fight incitement, must speak the truth. If President Abbas is committed to peace, he must stop inciting his people against Israel and start condemning the murder of innocents in Israel.
Before traveling to Paris, Prime Minister Netanyahu announced that the government would suspend diplomatic contacts with European bodies involved in efforts to revive the peace process with the Palestinians. This in response to the recent European Union's approval of new guidelines for labeling products manufactured in Israeli settlements in the West Bank and the Golan Heights. Netanyahu, who is also the foreign minister, described the EU's labeling decision as hypocritical and a double standard, stressing that the European bloc does not take similar measures in hundreds of territorial conflicts throughout the rest of the world. However, while in Paris, Netanyahu did meet with EU Foreign Policy Chief Federica Mogherini, who insisted that despite the Premier's declaration, the EU would continue its role in the quartet of Middle East peace brokers, along with the United Nations, the US, and Russia.
When it comes to the Middle East peace process, the EU continues and will continue to work on this in the quartet with our Arab partners, with both parties, because of course the peace in the Middle East is of interest to the whole international community and of course to the Europeans themselves.
In local politics this week, MK Yinon Magal of the Jewish Home Party announced he will resign from the Knesset following a series of sexual allegations leveled against him recently. Magal informed his party chairman, Education Minister Naftali Bennett, that while he is innocent of any criminal behavior, he understands that his previous actions may have offended certain people. Bennett, who was in the U.S. at the time, accepted his resignation, commending it as the right thing to do. Magal, a former journalist and newscaster, has been embroiled in controversy since last week when Racheli Rotner, a former employee of his during his time when he was editor-in-chief of the Walla news site, wrote a Facebook post about Magal's unwanted sexual gestures toward her. 3 other women filed suit complaining about his conduct, including one woman who alleged that Magal sexually assaulted her by forcibly kissing her. The state comptroller this week issued his report on irregular spending by Knesset members during party primaries ahead of general elections that took place in March. That report outlined a series of misdeeds by a number of MKs, primarily from the Likud and the Jewish Home parties. In the spotlight is Likud MK Oren Hazan, who apparently failed to report his spendings and even lied on an affidavit. Such actions can constitute a criminal offense that could potentially carry up to 3 years in prison. Hazan, a freshman MK who made headlines with a series of scandals since sitting in the Knesset, declared that he had spent no more than 7,000 shekels, which he paid from his own pocket. The report, however, addressed that he had in fact spent over 25,000 shekels provided from outside donor sources. Education Minister Naftali Bennett, Likud MK Gila Gamliel, and Labor's El Margalit were also among those fined for exceeding the amount of permitted campaign funding. We're coming back to you, Michael Parham of the Movement for Quality Government. And according to the State Comptroller's report, it appears that Oren Hazan lied. Should charges be taken against him?
Well, the fact that a politician does not tell the truth, I don't think comes as a great shock to anybody. However, this case and the movement has in fact asked the Attorney General to investigate and to file charges wherever necessary, points to a very distressing pattern of behavior and perjuring yourself in official documents and in official testimony, basically affidavits, to public officials. It's really stepping over a boundary which must be kept secure, and we feel that this bears looking into, and if necessary, he should be prosecuted for it. We think that there are certain matters, we're not talking about, whether I'm going to solve, the issues of world hunger or the problems of the Middle East in the next 4 years. We're talking about lying in a public sphere on personal finances, to an official body. And you just can't, shouldn't be done. It just shouldn't be done, in addition to being a criminal offense, which it clearly is. But in terms of public policy and what we at the Movement for Quality Government are working towards, and a better, more probity, more honesty, more transparency, more openness in politics, this is a real no-no.
Let's move on to Yidon Magal. Do you think he did the right thing by resigning?
Yes, he did the right thing by resigning. If, in fact, he is...
Does this say that he's guilty?
Well, he claims that there is no criminal aspect to his conduct. Many people think that the law against sexual harassment deals with sexual harassment in the workplace. And clearly there are many workplace situations where the sexual harassment is exacerbated by the relationship between the two parties. But in fact, the law against sexual harassment makes it a criminal offense to sexually harass anybody at any time, any place. So it would appear that some of the issues raised, some of the claims are borderline criminal or in fact criminal. We understand the Attorney General is investigating it, and he should investigate it. There is too many instances of sexual harassment, which is itself a form of corruption.
Michael, the whole Knesset image has been tainted. What has to be done now to repair that?
Well, we need leadership. We need, the old saying goes that the fish rots from the head, and so it's the head that has to give. Every year, the movement has awards. We try to find exemplars in our society who we can hold up to and look and say, look, it's possible to do it differently. In fact, our award ceremony is in 2 weeks, and we do award it to a number of politicians who we feel exemplify model behavior and the principles of quality government. So if the cup is half empty, it's also half full. There are examples, and we need that leadership.
Well, we're waiting to see that in 2 weeks. Thanks, Michael Parham of the Movement for Quality Government, for joining IBA News.
You're very welcome.
Marcus Klingberg, the KGB spy who revealed the secrets of Israel's biological capabilities, died in Paris this week, 17 years after he was released due to poor health conditions. Klingberg was an old-fashioned spy, a mole who was able to burrow his way into one of the most secret installations in Israel, the Institute for Biological Research in Ness Tziona. For nearly 30 years, he passed on information to the Soviets. He rose to become the deputy head of the institute with the rank of lieutenant colonel, and even confessed to giving the Russians a particularly vicious germ. He was described as the most dangerous spy who caused the most damage ever uncovered in Israel. The Shin Bet nabbed Klingberg in 1983, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison in a secret trial. His health deteriorated, yet the security establishment was adamant he not be released because they feared he still had secrets in his head. Only after 15 years in jail was he freed, and in 1998, he left the country for France to join his family. He died on Sunday at the age of 97. The protests against the government's controversial natural gas deal have almost become a matter of routine over the past weeks. Thousands demonstrated across the country throughout the weekend, including Tel Aviv, Haifa, Beersheba, Ashdod, and Jerusalem. Demonstrators lashed out against the government and business tycoons, which they claim have been granted a virtual monopoly to develop the country's natural gas reserves discovered off of Israel's coast. The Knesset Economics Committee has been discussing the decision by the Prime Minister, in his capacity as Economic Minister, to bypass the laws against monopolies citing national security concerns. Environmental Protection Minister Avi Gabay, who opposes the gas outline deal, testified to the committee but was barred from expressing his opposition. In any case, the legality of the entire move is expected to be challenged in the High Court of Justice. We're joining us now in the studio is Alon Tal, a veteran environmentalist activist and professor at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. Alon, it seems that this whole issue of the gas is being pushed. Netanyahu has done everything he can to get this pushed through, yet there's been protest against it. What's wrong with it?
Well, on the one hand, let's recognize we're talking about a 350 billion cubic meter reservoir of gas just from the Leviathan reservoir and wells. So we're talking about unbelievable amounts of money that are in play here. And I think that's what's gotten the public concerned, is that what seemed like at first a good deal for the state of Israel is not such a good deal, and that a unbelievably large amount of natural resources that the public feels should be theirs, the profits are actually going to go to an international corporation or to an Israeli tycoon. And that seems to be, by most people's perspective, highly unfair.
Do you see any similarities between the protests taking place now and the ones that happened in 2011 about social welfare?
There are some in terms of the level of indignation and the bottom-up concern. On the other hand, we're not talking about young people's inability to buy houses, so it's a little more abstract, so the demonstrations are smaller. But surely the same spirit and call to arms is being felt, and the social networks are doing their job.
Now let's take a look at this dramatic conference going on in Paris. Do you think that anything substantial could come out of this?
Well, I think already we've seen important progress. Let's remember that we face now two major international events, the Kyoto gathering of leaders, and then later in Copenhagen in 2009, which ended in failure. This time, before it even began, 150 countries came forward and made personal pledges, national commitments to reduce their greenhouse gases, their carbon footprint. The assumption is that if we had continued on our present track, international temperatures would have gone up by something like 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit. With these commitments, assuming the countries do what they say they will do, it'll only go up 2.7. The trouble is we know it can only go to 2. And even 2 is endangering the climate. So if you talk to people who are in Paris now, the assumption is let's get this major step forward, but we're going to have to double those kinds of reductions.
Well, can governments really implement these decisions? And where does Israel fit in all this?
Well, that is a great question, because what we're seeing internationally is there are good players and there are bad actors. Take a country like Germany. Already 27% of its energy is from renewable sources, and Angela Merkel went on the stage and said we're committing ourselves to 40%. Denmark is already at 50%. Israel, 2%. And you saw the coherent speech about energy policy that the Prime Minister gave to the Council. He came there talking about terrorism, and then talked about the importance of Israeli innovation. I would like to see a government position which says we take responsibility for the most important ecological challenge of our planet, and we commit ourselves to becoming the first carbon neutral country on Earth. We have the technology, we have the sunshine, we just don't have the political will.
Alon, stick with us. We're going to move on to some other topics I want you to comment on later. Israel and Jordan have announced a joint plan to construct a water-carrying canal from the Red Sea to the Dead Sea. The new $800 million project is expected to rehabilitate the shrinking Dead Sea while supplying drinking water to Israelis, Palestinians, and Jordanians. The 180-kilometer-long pipeline is slated to pass through Jordanian territory, carrying nearly 2 million cubic meters of seawater from the Red Sea that will be processed into drinking water at the Aqaba desalination plant. Israel and Jordan are now seeking a company to build and run the canal for 25 years as they officially released the tender this week. The World Bank, in conjunction with the U.S. and several European countries, will fund and support the project, which is expected to take up to 5 years to erect. Staying with the Green Beat, and some 6 beaches along the Tel Aviv-Herzliya coastline were closed down to the public on Sunday due to a deliberate sewage dump that was streamed into the waters as part of the infrastructure maintenance work conducted in the area. Some 180,000 cubic meters of sewage were pumped into the sea each day up until Wednesday. Environmental groups warn the sewage dumping is causing irreversible ecological damage. The beaches have yet to be reopened, and the public has been advised to stay away until further notice. So, Alon, that stinks, doesn't it?
We've got a lot of bad news environmentally, many challenges, Arya.
Let's look at the Dead Sea Canal. Is this a good thing for the Dead Sea or not?
Well, you have to remember our baseline situation. The Dead Sea is disappearing. Every year, the level goes down a little more than a meter, and the retreat is even greater. So we have to decide as a society, do we want to let this unique resource, the world's lowest sea, with this phenomenally important tourism and historic meaning, are we going to let it disappear or not? And the attempt of these kind of conduits, or dead med canals, if you want, red med canals, are an attempt to do something to intervene to stop what seems to be the ineluctable disappearance of the Dead Sea. So that's good. There are environmental risks involved, and there are many environmentalists who are very concerned about them. But to sit and do nothing, to me, is not an option.
Well, as an environmentalist, should we let Mother Nature take its path? I mean, if it's being dried up, why build dams and why pump in water?
Well, if we had let Mother Nature take her path, there would be 1.1 billion cubic meters of water flowing every year down the River Jordan into the Dead Sea. But we take some of that water for the national water carrier from the Kinneret Lake, and the Jordanians take water from the Yarmouk, and the Syrians block water, and today we get less than 10% of that. So we haven't, there's no ability to go back to that original state of nature. So what we have to do is be thoughtful and very precautionary about this, but ultimately I think that to sit and do nothing is not an option, and we have to look to these kind of options. I hope we can do it slowly and carefully with a lot of monitoring.
Now, the Green Movement has been able to get somebody in the Knesset this time on the new list. She's a new member of the Knesset. Where does Israel stand when it comes to dealing with the environment?
Israel has,
Very
over the
briefly,
years, well, we could talk about this for a whole special session, but the truth of the matter is we've seen incremental progress, but in the big picture, Israel still is failing. We're losing our biodiversity. We used to have 9,000 gazelles in the country, naturally down to 3,000. Almost every mammal species is disappearing. It's largely as a result of the growing population, which takes over these open spaces. We've seen a lot of movement to more of a consumer culture, and we haven't really had the commitment as a country to make the difference. So I believe we have all the tools in place, but we still have much work to do, and it's great. Here's a shout out to Yael Cohen-Farhan, Knesset, Israel's first Green member of Knesset. It's a big moment for us.
Alon Tal, professor at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, thanks for joining us. And this final story, archaeologist Eilat Mazar, who has been excavating in Jerusalem for decades, says she's uncovered a seal that may have belonged to the biblical king Hezekiah himself. The seal, made out of clay and known as a bula, was discovered in a dig next to the Temple Mount. It measures about 1 centimeter across and says clearly in ancient Hebrew, Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah. There was also a 2-winged sun, a motif that originated with the Assyrians, and 2 anaks. Other seals like this are in existence, but this is the first one ever found on site in an excavation. Mazar said it dates from around 700 before the Common Era. Hezekiah is one of the most well-known ancient kings mentioned in many sources beyond the Bible, and he ruled for 30 years. The seal also shows the imprint of a ring, which makes it very likely to have been held by the king himself. In a way, this makes it sort of like a tweet from the past. Well, that brings us to the end of this special weekly edition of IBA News. As you're probably aware, we're working on resuming a daily bulletin in the near future. Progress is being made, and we hope to return to the upcoming weeks to a full-time show. In the meantime, you're invited to send us your comments to ibaletters@gmail.com. That's ibaletters@gmail.com. I'm Aryeh O'Sullivan wishing you a good week, a shalom from Jerusalem.